Rabbi with the music. Ready?
אהבה כזו כבר לא מוצאים, סודות שמורים בלב שלי שנים, שקט בין מילים, לב שבוי הופך שירים, שתיקה הופכת למגיעה. אהבה כזו כבר לא מוצאים, לאט ואוחזים ידיים לצידי, כולם עוברים, אוספים שברים מסוד חיים, הופכות לשיר ומעניין. ירח מתמלא ומתרוקן, מתקרב ומתרחק, אבל הלב שלי יוצא לך, שוב בורח, שוב חוזר. אין יום אחד שיעבור, מי שאחשוב אליך, כמו ירח מתמלא ומתרוקן. אתה קרב ומתרחק, אבל הלב שלי יוצא אליך, שוב בורח, שוב חוזר. אין יום אחד שיעבור, בלי שאחשוב עליך.
And that is Idan Rachel, and I'm Steve Skurka, and welcome to Afternoon with Steve. And it's appropriate, I think, that we have Israeli music because our guest today, Rabbi Vernon Kutrz, comes to us from Jerusalem in his apartment. It's late at night there, so I'm grateful. Welcome to the program, Rabbi, and thank you for joining us.
My pleasure.
And Rabbi, you have an unusual journey. Takes you to Medina Israel, to Israel, and we're going to go through that during the program. But I think we should start with how the two of us met many years ago, because you were born in Toronto and you lived your formative years, at least your adolescence in Toronto, up to I think university, until you went to New York to study for your smicha. So let's just start with that. How did we meet? Where was it that you and I met, Rabbi?
Camp Remind, Canada. I was a counselor and you were one of my campers. It was
I was a 10-year-old camper, yes.
There you go.
And here we are. It just we never foresaw that we'd be doing a Zoom program one day where I'd be interviewing you as a rabbi, but you know, life takes many strange twists. So
yeah, and
so
it does.
Good
thing we both had good experiences. Otherwise, this wouldn't be too much fun. So
that's right. It'll be a lot of fun, Rabbi, and informative. But how is it that you came to you? As I understand, you actually were thinking of going to law school, and then your life turned, and you went to get your ordination as a rabbi. So maybe you can just describe how you moved from Canada and then transition into the rabbinate, and then we'll go to your congregation next.
I'll make this story short, but I was born in Toronto. My parents, Bernie and Dorothy Kutrz, Alav Shalom, were also born in Toronto, and grew up at Bathurst and Lawrence on Ridgeville Avenue, and then moved a little further south to Warwick Avenue, and lived there through my formative years. I went to the Associated Hebrew Schools, first class that started on Neptune, and graduated all through Chat, same building. And when I finished high school, I went to York University and graduated in 3 years from York. And it was after I finished York that I had to decide what I was going to do. So I had been involved towards my high school years in USY, specifically through Beth Am congregation, which was on Keele and Wilson area, and got involved in Camp Vermont, Canada, became friendly with lots of people within the movement, began to study in my university years, mostly about Judaism. But as you said, I did apply to law school, was accepted to Western Ontario, and wasn't sure I wanted to go, so I decided to take a year off and study in Israel. And during that year, I studied at Hebrew University and also a place called Neve Shechter, now the Shechter Institute, which is was part of the Jewish Theological Seminary, and decided during the year that I really wanted to go on to rabbinical school at JTS in New York. I applied, came back that June This was 1972. 1972. Was accepted to the school. Went back to Camp Vermont, Canada, and after that summer, started my rabbinical school studies at JTS, beginning in September of 1972.
You met your wife, Brian, at Hebrew University, I understand.
No, I met my wife a lot earlier. I met my wife when I was 15 and she was 14, a lot earlier. Brian and family were involved in Beth Am at that point. And that's how I got involved in Beth Am USY, very frankly. And we were together for 7 years, and thank God I've been married for 47 years now.
All right. But I'm
She's
right,
been definitely part of the journey.
Yes. All right. So let's talk about being a rabbi of a major congregation in Chicago. That's the Bethel congregation. Is that right?
Well, I was rabbi at two places. I came in 1976. I was ordained. I was at the seminary for 4 years, including 1 year studying back in Israel. In 1976, I was ordained, and I came to be the assistant rabbi at Congregation Rodfei Tzedek, which, if anybody knows Chicago, on the south part of Chicago in Hyde Park, near the University of Chicago. I was assistant rabbi, then associate rabbi, and then rabbi of the congregation. And I was there for 12 years. And then I moved to the north part of Chicago, to Highland Park. It's a northern suburb of Chicago, where I was a senior rabbi at North Suburban Synagogue Bethel for 31 years, and retired from there in June 2019.
And for baseball fans, you went from White Sox territory in Chicago to Cub territory. Am I right?
That would be correct, although in both places there were people who would be rivals as well.
Okay. So what I want to ask you about is my focus is on the major. This Bethel is a major congregation in Chicago, and you were there for many years. So just perhaps you could just briefly describe that community, what you did there, and what your experiences were as a rabbi of the congregation.
Sure. Bethel is an 1,100 family congregation, quite a traditional conservative congregation with a preschool, a religious school, many kids at day school. It had a Hebrew high school as well, and supplemental. It had adult education, full synagogue like the Shalom would be, or any of the major synagogues in Toronto. Minyanim morning and evening, obviously services on Shabbos and holidays. On Shabbat, we would fill the holiday, we would fill the sanctuary with about 1,800 people, and as well, about 45-minute walk away was Highland Park High School, and filled out another 700 to 800 people. Those days are over right now, obviously, for this year, but that's the way it was back then. It was a congregation of some major leaders in the conservative movement, in the Federation movement, in the Israel-oriented movement. I was there as the senior rabbi with a large staff. I taught, I pastored, I preached, did everything that the rabbis do. And I was very involved in the community as well. I was involved in the Jewish Federation of Metropolitan Chicago. I was an officer there. I had a number of both local, national, and international positions with the conservative movement. I was president of the Rabbinical Assembly, which is the organization of all the conservative rabbis of the world from 2000 to 2002. I was president of Merkaz USA, the same as Merkaz Canada, the Zionist organization of the movement. I was president of Merkaz Olami. My last position was I was the president of the American Zionist movement, equivalent again of the CZF, and was involved in interfaith things. And I was also involved, as your wife Randy knows, in academics as well, in teaching, which we'll talk about a little bit too, I'm sure. So it was a major part of major congregation, but I was also involved in a number of other things as well.
So Rabbi, let me ask you about a certain perception that I believe is prevalent. And it's a notion that in Canadian synagogues like Beth Shalom and Sher Shemaim, an Orthodox synagogue, the affiliation, the adherence to Israel is organic and is at the core of religious and Jewish belief. And that there's a sense that in America, it's subordinate to issues of social justice, that it isn't as prominent and as the attachment to the state of Israel. Is that true or fallacious?
I think it's a generalization. That's not necessarily true. Beth El was a very Zionist congregation. I had no problem speaking about Israel from the pulpit. We were affiliated with AIPAC. We had many leaders in the Federation world, leaders in the pro-Israel policy world, and it was just an inimical part of the congregation's programming, planning, my philosophy. I spoke about Zionism and obviously made Aliyah myself. There are different congregations in different regions and different places. And the same would be true today in Canada as well. Toronto is, I think, a bastion of Zionism and Israel-oriented pro-Israel agenda. I don't know if that's all across Canada anymore either. I just don't know. So I think it's a generalization, but to be honest with you, because you hear only, as usual, the poles, the polar opposites. You don't hear most of the middle, which is pro-Israel and concerned about Israel, even if it might disagree with certain aspects of Israeli policy or the government policy, as the case may be.
Right. So you made Aliyah about a year ago. I believe it was the end of June a year ago. And was that decision a sudden one, or it was one that formative over a number of years?
Well, I've been coming back and forth to Israel quite frequently. I have a daughter who made Aliyah after she finished university or college at Barnard in New York and finished in 1999. Came here. Eventually, she married and she has 4 children. My oldest grandson, God willing, in 6 weeks will have a bar mitzvah. They live in Modi'in. That pulled us here. My wife's sister Leah made Aliyah in 1978 and has her family here. We have some very close cousins who made Aliyah from Toronto years ago on both my grandmother's side and my grandfather's side. So I have a family stake here. And I came back to study for a couple of years, one after my university education, one during my rabbinical school education. I've been on the board of the Jewish Agency, so I was coming back again at least twice a year, 3 times a year for meetings. I've been studying at the Shalom Hartman Institute. So Israel was part of our agenda. But when we got here a year ago in June, we were met here at our apartment. We bought an apartment 11 years ago here in Israel because we were coming back and forth so frequently. My then not 8-year-old granddaughter asked my wife, "When did you decide to make Aliyah?" And Brian had correctly said, about 45 years ago. When we were here as students, we already thought, gee, this is the place to be. But it is difficult to be a conservative rabbi here. I still needed to make a living, and I think I spent a worthwhile career in the pulpit and in the work that I did in the United States and Chicago and the work that I did throughout the community. But it was always on our mind that this would be the place that we wanted to come to. And as we bought the apartment 11 years ago and began moving closer to concepts of retirement, we knew this is where we wanted to retire. We had no family in Chicago, so nothing pulled us to stay in Chicago besides the work and the friendships and the community that we established there. And this, in many ways, was just a natural for us. But it really started, I agree, with the answer we gave our granddaughter about 45 years ago. They call it in Israeli terms, Aliyah bishlavim, that you make Aliyah over a period of time in stages. And that's exactly what we did until June 2019 with Nefesh B'Nefesh. We arrived at the Ben Gurion Airport, and first thing we did was get our Teudat Oleh. We got our new card, which says that we are now citizens of the state of Israel.
All right. So we're going to talk about your adjustment to life in Israel, but you've been very open in writing and speaking about a medical setback that you had shortly, within weeks of your arrival in Israel. Can you just describe that, please? Sure,
without too much detail. About a month after I was here, I had a heart attack. I had no experience in it whatsoever. I had a good checkup in May before I left. Everything was fine. I exercise every day. I would say I had a little bit of pressure during my career. Being a pulpit rabbi of 1,100 families was not an easy thing, but it was unexpected and came on all of a sudden, and actually happened one Sunday morning, and eventually was taken to Hadassah Hospital by ambulance and in Kerem. I had a an artery that was closed in the back of my heart. The stent was put in. They saw there was another problem. A week later, I was back in again. They fixed the other stent. And since that time, I've been doing rehab and doing even more exercise and trying to take care of myself and watching our diet and doing a lot of walking and seeing cardiologists, etc. I'm pleased that the Israeli medical system served me at least until this point very well, very responsibly. Magen David Adom, Hadassah Hospital, my own Kupat Cholim, my own health corps, and my own doctor. Thank God, like you got to work at it. And so I'm now one of those people who are with the corona considered to be health sensitive. So I have to take care of myself a little more carefully because of that. But otherwise, thank God, things have been good. And I think, Steve, I think I consider myself kind of grateful that this had happened before I left. Would never made Aliyah at that particular moment. Was able to get here, set roots down, and pleased that it worked that way.
Yeah. Okay, well, let's leave that behind us now, and let's just talk about your adjustment to life in Israel. I appreciate you had roots and you had a connection and you can continually visit, but that's very different than leaving a community behind and starting a new life in a different country and in a completely different type of community. Was there a period of adjustment for you, Rabbi?
Well, there always is a period of adjustment whenever you move. When I moved from Toronto to New York, and when I moved to New York to Chicago, there still is a period of adjustment, getting used to a new city, a new community, new friends. Where do you shop? Where is your barber? Where's your doctor? Et cetera, et cetera. All of that is part of a move. This obviously is a different culture and a different language and a different region. But I said to people that, number one, Brian and I are fluent in Hebrew. Number two, we had an apartment. Number three, I wasn't looking for a job. And number four, I had supportive family and friends. If I don't make it, it's my fault and not Israel's fault. So we had certain things that we came with us. I wasn't looking for a job or to make a living. I've been teaching here and doing some writing in that. We can talk about that if you wish. So it wasn't like I needed employment in that sense. We had the apartment. We had totally furnished it. The key thing for us really was Hebrew. I learned even that I can yell in Hebrew and fight back in Hebrew with some of the bureaucrats if I really needed to. And then I knew I made it. We spent long hours watching the news because it helps our Hebrew. Our son-in-law, who lives here with our daughter, is from Argentina. So our language of conversation is always Hebrew. And the kids grew up with three languages: English from our daughter and Spanish from my son-in-law. And of course, the language of the house is really, in their schools, is Hebrew. So we hear Hebrew when we talk English with them and talk Hebrew with them all the time. That made the transition much easier, but there were things that we had to get used to. I learned a lot of Hebrew, but I didn't know all the medical terms, and still I had this medical issue. I still don't know all the terms that relate to the army. I never will, I hope, in many ways. There are certain things that I'm not up on, and periodically I have to stop and ask the people, what do you mean about this insurance policy and that? But overall, it's actually been an easy transition, and not having to work and look for employment has really, made it so it would take a little longer, that kind of thing.
All right. So you were involved in teaching, I know, in Chicago because you taught Randy, my wife, at Skurka College, and I know that you've continued teaching in the state of Israel. So perhaps you could just speak to how important vital teaching is in your life.
Sure, I appreciate that. Well, I always taught at the congregation. I always taught adult education, but I have a doctorate. I have a doctor of ministry from Chicago Theological Seminary, which is a Christian theological school in Chicago, near the University of Chicago. And I taught for many years at Skurka College, or now the Skurka Institute of Learning and Leadership. Privileged to teach your wife, Randy, as she worked towards her MA in 2 classes, and it really kind of brought this circle back for us as well in many ways. I enjoyed teaching at Skurka, even though it was, on top of a busy congregational life in a community world, etc., but very important to me. Here, I'm now teaching. I started in person, of course. Now it's all on Zoom for the Fuchsburg Center which is the conservative center here in Israel. Many of you may know it as the Agron Center. I just taught a class open to everybody on by Zoom, both in North America and in Israel on Sunday on Tu B'Av, the 15th day of Av, which is a day of love in Jewish tradition, which begins this evening, at least here, to begin there in the evening as well. I'm teaching as well in adult education for the Schechter Institute, which is, again, the rabbinical seminary here for the conservative movement, the educational seminary. And it, like anything, I love teaching. Teaching on Zoom is not as much fun as in person, but one of the great things about teaching, and you know this, is that you have to prepare and you have to work hard and you do research, so you end up learning even more than you end up the opportunity to teach. So that's been fun. I've done some writing for some books, and I've written some blogs, which you can find in the Times of Israel, and starting to get involved in some of the Israeli organizations here as well, in addition to the ones that I'm currently involved with, even before I came.
And Randy says you're a wonderful teacher. I just want
Oh,
to
that's sweet.
add
Thank
that,
you. You're a great student. I loved having her in class.
So I read an interesting comment you made in an interview, and you were asked if you missed giving sermons, because of course, as a congregational rabbi, that is part of your weekly life, and during Chagim even more than weekly. And you said, not as much as I thought I would. That was your exact answer. So let me ask you this question. When you look back at the community you left in Chicago, what would you be your biggest surprise about leaving it, both pleasant and unpleasant, that's occurred to you since you moved to the state of Israel?
Well, let's put it this way. First of all, because I've been teaching, I'm still doing my thing, if you will. And it so happens that I'm giving the Dvar Torah this Shabbat at my synagogue here in Israel, a conservative synagogue, an egalitarian conservative synagogue. It's in Hebrew. I have to write it in Hebrew, which is a good challenge. So I'm still preaching, but not in the same way. This time it's volunteer stuff. You know what you miss from the pulpit is the sense of connection that you have with people. I like to tell the story that one of the last things I did on the pulpit there was name a young girl. What was significant for me was I had named her mother. I had done her mother's bat mitzvah. I had married her mother under the chuppah to her husband, and I was the third person they called after the baby was born to tell me that they had a new girl. So I was able to name her. That kind of relationship is part of being in a synagogue for 31 years. I've missed some of that. Some people still stay in touch with us. It's easy to do by email. I still have the same email address I had there. Others do some Zoom. People came to Israel at the beginning of the year, would get in touch with us. Many more had planned to do so. Obviously, that's out of the question right now. On the other hand, I don't miss the politics, and I don't miss the administration and the daily details and what Rabbi Aaron would know only too well, all of the politics in the congregation. I don't want to go there. And that I don't miss. But the teaching and the relationships and those will always remain be with me and part of me.
Okay. So you alluded to the area of questioning that I now want to ask you about. You said that it was very difficult to be a conservative rabbi in Israel. And I read a blog that you wrote, and this is a direct quote. You wrote, "There is a very serious problem of religion and state in the state of Israel." And I wanted to ask you what you meant by describing that problem, please.
Well, I think probably all of your listeners know that Israel religion is controlled by the chief rabbinate and by the ultra-Orthodox. Because it's all political, they're in the government, they're part of now Netanyahu's coalition. They have them over the barrel once more with a decision that was made yesterday and today. If you wish, I'll tell you about it. And they control basically religion and state. So that while I, as a conservative rabbi, could write a letter for someone who wanted to make aliyah, because chok hashvut, the ability to make aliyah is a civil issue, and therefore controlled through the Knesset, and they have to accept a recognized conservative or reform rabbi's letter. I cannot marry somebody here, participate in a conversion here that will be accepted, because the interior ministry, which has almost always been controlled by the ultra-Orthodox, does not recognize me as a rabbi. And therefore, my synagogue would not be recognized, and the work that I do is not recognized in the rabbinical sense. Whereas almost all the ultra-Orthodox subsidies for their yeshivot and for their synagogues, the conservative movement has to be able to raise money through the Masorti Foundation, through the Canadian Foundation for Masorti Judaism, which you have there, or in the United States or around the world, in order to maintain synagogues or community centers or youth programs called Noam, or hire rabbis, as the case may be. And because of that, I think religion suffers. One of the good parts of religion, the fact that religion is not controlled by the state in either Canada or the States, is that there is quote unquote competition. And everybody decides which synagogue they want to go to. If you're Orthodox and don't want to be comfortable in a conservative synagogue, that's fine. Okay, you don't need to be. But here, if you want to be married and be recognized by the religious state, you have to be recognized by one of the rabbis who are recognized by the state. That is no conservative rabbi, no reform rabbi, many modern Orthodox rabbis as well, only those recognized by the state. And conversions outside of Israel are only recognized in Israel as by those who are, again, right-wing orthodoxy. And instead of competition, there is a monopoly. And that monopoly hurts religion, so that people who might be interested in religion or might be turned on to sense of spirituality feel stultified by the fact that it's controlled by the ultra-Orthodox, who do not seem inviting, and in many cases lay down the letter of the law without any kind of spirit of the law as well. I think it's unfortunate for Israel. I think it's unfortunate for Judaism. And they should be part of the competition out there, if you will, in terms of trying to attach the souls of Jews to Judaism in its widest sense of the term.
But surely this has to be impressed upon political leaders like Netanyahu. Are they just unable to break free, or are they unwilling to break free?
They're politicians. They're politicians. The best example was, and I was part of it because I'm part of the Jewish Agency, we had worked out, as many of you know, a compromise for the Kotel, where what is now known as the Kotel Shivyoni, the egalitarian Kotel, which is open to people to have their b'nai mitzvah there, and to go there and stand together. Was worked out by Natan Sharansky, together with the conservative reform movements and the government of Israel, so that there would be one entrance, and you would then decide where you would go to the Kotel. You want to go to the men's side, the women's side, or the egalitarian side. There would be a sense of working together. Originally, the ultra-Orthodox agreed, but when it came to the chief rabbinate, they didn't. This was supposed to be passed through the cabinet, and the pressure on Netanyahu was so strong that he ultimately dropped it, has never picked it up, frozen the agreement, though it was totally agreed by everybody, and ultimately turned off much of diaspora Jewry in that realm. So when you hear of the Kotel issue, that's exactly what happened. Just today, because the ultra-Orthodox said they don't want to go to elections, and there's a whole fight here of what's happening between Kachol V'Lavan, blue and white, and Netanyahu's party, Likud, and they may go to the other side. All of a sudden, he has said, we're going to advance them the money for the yeshivot. The other schools aren't getting the money yet because there's no budget. There's a whole fight over the budget. But for the yeshivot now, they're going to find hundreds of thousands of shekel to be able to give to the ultra-Orthodox. So in many ways, like the United States government, people don't understand as much as I do because I grew up in Canada. So you know about coalition politics and minority governments, in the sense that the smaller parties in many cases control basically what goes on in terms of legislation and the movement of the government. And that's what happens here. And that's unfortunate. That makes those who are not in that realm of ultra-Orthodoxy, from just religious Zionists to totally secular, totally turned off from the sense of religion, from ultra-Orthodoxy, and from that realm. And unless and until we can break that ultra-Orthodox monopoly of religion in the political realm, it's going to be the same.
Is there currently a conservative Jewish movement in the state of Israel?
Yes, it's called the Masorti movement. It has a number of 50, 60 congregations or minyanim attached to it. It has a youth group called Noam. It has a rabbinical assembly. It has a group of rabbis. Many rabbis are trained at Schechter. It has a young adult group. It had a Camp Ramat until this summer. Oh yes, it's strong, but it's reliant upon every person on this Zoom screen and all of us around the world to support them, because the government does not support them.
All right. So let's turn to COVID, because we can't possibly have a discussion about the state of Israel without talking about the impact of COVID-19. We've been reading about it, of course. We've read that things opened up and it seemed to be premature and that there were problems. So perhaps you can give us your perspective on the impact of COVID-19, first on the country and then on you personally.
So what happened here was the government, and particularly Netanyahu, was really on it very quickly. And they decided to close us down in very much of a lockdown very quickly as well. And so for a long period of time near the beginning of COVID-19, basically everything closed. The schools closed, the synagogues closed. We were allowed to walk 100 meters from our house. You were allowed to run a little further. You could go shopping, you can go to the pharmacy, but that was it. I tell a story that in 2019 at my Seder table, I said, like all of us, the Shana Haba Yerushalayim, next year in Jerusalem. What we really meant was the Shana Haba Modi'in. We wanted to be with our kids and grandchildren in the city of Modi'in. Well, we weren't. We actually were in Jerusalem, just the two of us. Nobody was allowed to go to anybody else's Seder. You were allowed simply in your house. And for much of the Pesach, police closed off the cities. We were actually stuck. We went out for a walk. I think it was on the 7th day of Pesach, which is the last day of Pesach here. We were actually stopped by the police and say, where do you live? Because we were allowed 100 meters from our house. And we said, just over there. They said, okay, just be careful. So we closed down very quickly. And the numbers therefore showed that we were able to control it, though we didn't know exactly what was happening. As that happened, the economy began to collapse as well. Hundreds of thousands of people come for Pesach. They couldn't come here. Israelis go on trips around the country. Those were all canceled. Businesses had to close, etc. You know what that's like in Canada as well. And as that happened, the economy began to shut. And so over a period of time, as Netanyahu would come on every night and give us a lecture on what you have to wear your masks, and you have to do social distancing, and you have to keep your hygiene, and we're going to get this under control, people believed him and really followed. Israelis are good at following emergency situations because they've been through so many of them. They've been through wars and terrorist actions, and they know how to follow terrorist groups. But when you give them a choice, or when you tell them things that do not make sense, they rebel because they always know better. That's the Israeli chutzpah. So at one point, they began to open up a little bit. And the famous quote that Netanyahu said, he got on the TV and said, things are moving nicely, go out and have fun, go have a beer, go to a theater or go to a coffee house. And that was the wrong thing to do. Because as we began to open up, it opened up very quickly. They talked about going back to schools, and originally it was only certain grades, and eventually it was the whole school. They talked of not opening up the stores, and eventually the stores opened up. There's certain things that never opened. There's still no theater here, there's no concerts, and all those people, and we'll come if you a little later if you want to talk about the protests, have really lost everything. All of those people have gotten no income the last 5 months. So what's happened in the last little while is that we lost control of it. And the numbers began to go up, even as the testing went up. The number of deaths have gone up, unfortunately, and the number of people in the hospital have gone up. And that has created a situation where Israel is talking about backtrack. What can they keep closed? During the week, we closed the gyms. Well, we won't know until the next night whether we chose the gyms. The next morning, next night they were open. That's when the Israelis don't get it. Then they rebel and say, "The heck, we're going to take care of themselves as they should." There were gatherings of Haredi people in the huge numbers. There were gatherings of young people in huge numbers, and the coronavirus is now rather strong here in Israel. We backslided terribly. They have now hired somebody to be the projector, the director of it. We're still waiting for his plan. There's a corona cabinet. There's a corona committee in the Knesset. They don't always agree. They fight it out in public. They're fighting in the government. Where we were almost one of the top 3 countries around the world, the last I read, we were one of the bottom 6 in terms of our numbers. Israel is closed totally in the skies, although interestingly enough, you can make aliyah at this point. My nephew, who grew up in New York, my brother-in-law and sister-in-law's son, just made aliyah 2 weeks ago. He was here for a Masa program last year after finishing his high school, was here for 6 months, was going to travel. That travel was out, stayed in New York. He just made aliyah. For 2 weeks, he was in isolation. And this morning, we spoke to him this evening, is now out of isolation and can now go about his life here in Israel. People are still making aliyah here. But if you don't have an Israeli passport, you can't get into it. The big decision made in the last few days is that they're going to allow students and yeshiva students to be able to come in certain kinds of numbers, provided they go into isolation, provided they study in certain capsules, which will allow people to be able to study in these conservative programs, the yeshivot, the miklalot, the Orthodox programs, etc. So they're really, where we thought we had it under control, we're not that way. And the last thing I'll say is that there has been an enormous amount of social unrest here. You've probably seen the pictures of the thousands who've been protesting here in Israel. Some of them were protesters started because they were worried about their economic status. They had lost almost everything. What they had lost was the ability to do their work and to be paid for it. And that's how the demonstration started. They've now gone to a much larger, outside the prime minister's house, to say that Netanyahu should resign, having to do with the way he's managed this, number one, but more than that, the fact that he's officially, as you know, as a trial lawyer, under indictment. And his trial is started already very slowly, and some people feel that he shouldn't be the prime minister and also under indictment. So again, what happens here? Protesters get close to one another. Some wear masks, some don't. We're convinced that that has added to the number of people who've gotten COVID as well. Now, how has it affected me?
Yeah.
Let me just say, well, the answer is we don't see our kids as much as we'd like to. We see them, we don't go there for Shabbat. We'll see them in spurts of a few hours, wearing masks, mostly outside, not touching one another, washing our hands all the time. We spend most of our time inside. My teaching is all by Zoom. We're able to go to synagogue because I'm able to sit outside for 19 people. And I don't have to worry about the rain here in Israel during the summer. But there's no travel. Very careful where we go and where we buy things and all those kind of things. No cultural stuff. Don't go to restaurants. That was part of what we do here. And don't see us. We sit for a couple times on Shabbat. We'll go visit some friends and sit on their balcony for 40 minutes wearing masks as we social distance.
Yeah. Sounds like a very grim situation, Rabbi. You described Netanyahu's indictment and upcoming trial, but what's interesting to me is that was no surprise to the Israelis who elected him as prime minister. And of course, you are in a situation where you've come to the state of Israel in just about a year and have voted twice already. And if you'd come a bit earlier, you would have voted 3 times. So
Right.
what's the difference between, I did my research.
You did
So
it, you read.
What's the difference, between being in a system where you have a presidential election every 4 years and basically this ball gun of politics in the current place where you're living, the country you're living now?
Well, again, having grown up in Canada, I'm used to the leader of the party being the one who is usually with the largest party, usually the one elected as the prime minister. That's not the way it is in the States. There was a short period of time here in Israel where elections separated the vote for the prime minister from the party, but that didn't go. It was, I think, one election, if I remember correctly. The difference here between here in Canada is that there are no districts. You're no ridings. You're not elected to represent people. You represent a party. So Netanyahu or Benny Gantz or whoever it may be, the Labor Party, simply give you a list of people sometimes through their primaries or sometimes simply through the fiat of their leader, and you vote. You vote for the party. The party that has the most voters then that gets to get the most seats. They don't represent anybody. They don't represent me because they don't care about me personally, what's happening in my apartment or my area. They care about their party and their politics. And so it's not representative in that case. On the other hand, as I wrote and as you read, democracy works here. We've had 2 elections. They had 3rd even before I came. And the country continues. There's not been a coup d'etat. There's not been an overturn. It's all been elected democratically. I'm used to the fight to create coalitions. Twice it didn't work. The last time it did. That coalition is a little bit in trouble right now as they have some issues that are going on amongst the different groups. So it was thrilling to vote here as a citizen. I said many times to my community that a generation in 2,000 years that doesn't know a world with the state of Israel. That's a phenomenal statement, absolutely phenomenal statement, which gives me a great deal of pride and a great deal of obligation and responsibility. And that means I'm the first generation in 2,000 years, because I was born after this, to get the state, obviously, to vote for a Jewish democratic government. That, Steve, is an amazing statement when you think of it in terms of the realms of Jewish history. It's a privilege. Voting is a privilege wherever you are. Being in Israel is even a greater privilege. Unfortunately, politics in Israel is very political. Everything is political. And it works, but it doesn't work that well. And those who, if they had the choice, many people would change the system so it'd be more representative, and there wouldn't be so many little parties who basically, like the Haredim, seem to control the agenda rather than the larger parties.
Is it your impression, and I'm only asking, of course, of your impression, Rabbi, that Trump is popular in the state of Israel? Because I know that was the case at the beginning of his presidency.
There's no doubt that if you speak about Trump here in Israel, people are extremely pleased by the fact that it was this president who allowed the embassy to move from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. Israelis, and I think most Jews, have always believed that Israel is the eternal capital, Jerusalem is the eternal capital of the state of Israel. And therefore, Israelis should decide where that embassy is, where the capital is. That was a major statement. And they were pleased that the Golan was accepted as part of Israel. And a number of things in terms of BDS and other things that on a political level. The Trump plan at first was seen as a great opportunity for Israel, but it has received a great deal of criticism as well, both on the right and the left. Left see it as an opportunity for annexation, which they don't agree on. They want a two-state solution through negotiations. The right has believed that part of the Trump plan is the possibility or the eventual establishment of a Palestinian state, which they are against. So that person is reading it the way they want. If you speak to people about Trump in terms of his international work for Israel, there's a great deal of support. However, if you speak to most people who have an understanding of American politics, and especially Americans here who will vote in the American election, and they have very few good things to say about President Trump for obvious reasons. And I'll stop there.
Yeah, no, I don't want to go too far with it. I just wanted your impression. What about your impression of the perception of Israelis to diaspora and diaspora Jews? What would you say that is?
Well, that's one of the things I'm actually working on. I'll explain that. Israelis know very little about diaspora Jewry, and some say they don't care. First of all, as you recall, Ben-Gurion established the state and dealt with the fact that everybody should make Aliyah. I was present and learned out was as well as a youngster when David Ben-Gurion spoke from that high pulpit. And he told all of us that we better move to Israel. That's what Jews should do. It was known as Shlilat HaGola, the denigration of the exile of the people who lived in diaspora. And to a large extent, the diaspora itself at that point was negated. His view was from the Tanakh to the Palmach. All that related to the Talmud and all of the Halakha and medieval Jewry wasn't important. We were back in our state. That continued for a long period of time. Over a period of time, there was a recognition that Israel needs diaspora Jewry, especially American Jewry, because of the needs to help the Israeli government with arms, defense, United Nations votes, et cetera, et cetera. But if you ask Israelis about diaspora Jewry, they know very little. By that I mean, they have no concept of what Jewish pluralism is about, what conservative reform is about, how much is they have to work to be Jewish. Here you're just Jewish by the fact that you're in a Jewish state. Our calendar, as I wrote, simply goes by the Jewish calendar. There, you all know that you have to work at being Jewish every single day, because no matter where you are the minority. Here, we are the majority. And so if you ask Israelis, in many cases, they weren't concerned about the Kotel. It didn't matter to them. They didn't get it. They didn't understand why diaspora Jewry was so upset with that failure by the Netanyahu government. They don't understand why diaspora Jewry has views that, for some of them, of course they were going to vote for Richard Nixon in the past. He supported Israel in 1973. Of course, some of them were going to vote for Trump. He's a supporter of Israel. That's all you need to have. So what has been recognized is that to create this sense of family, not only do diaspora Jews have to learn about Israel, but Israel has to learn about diaspora Jewry to open itself up to a new way of thinking. And so, for instance, in the Jewish Agency, I am part of a committee called the Unity of the Jewish People Committee, and on a subcommittee called the Ami Unity Committee, whose purpose is to work in educational venues, in schools, mostly secular, in youth groups, even in pre-army academies, and train the educators on what it means to be a diaspora Jew, what it means to be a Jew all over the world. And in many cases, they have taken these educators for the first time to the States. I don't know if any of them have been in Canada, they may have been, some other places around the world as well, to see what a conservative synagogue is, what a Solomon Schechter Day School is, what a JCC is, what a federation is. Israelis have no concept of these things. I'm part of a program through the Schechter Institute where we're going to bring a whole group of teachers to Chicago. It was supposed to happen, but because of the virus, it hasn't happened yet. I have a Zoom meeting tomorrow to try to plan that visit. I'm also part of a group at the Shalom Hartman Institute with Israeli academics, dealing with the concept of peoplehood and the concept of not only Israelis demanding or expecting things out of diaspora Jews, but diaspora Jews should expect certain things out of Israelis. That includes helping Israelis, diaspora Jews get here through birthright and Masa and those kind of things, as well as to be able to have dialogues and understand the feelings of diaspora Jews on many different ways. So there is a movement through the Jewish Agency, through some of the educational enterprises, and I've already, to be able to feel, to learn what diaspora Jews feel, hear, learn, and what we can teach one another if we're truly part of a family. You have some things on chat, so
Rabbi,
just so you should know. I'm not going to answer. I'll leave it to you.
Yeah, but I just wanted to ask you, in view of what COVID, the profound impact of COVID on tourism, you haven't had tourists, an influx of tourists since March in the country, several months. It's devastating to the economy. Isn't there a better appreciation now of how important the diaspora is, just in the sense of the connection, the kesher between the diaspora and the state of Israel?
Well, the question, kesher or just bringing money? Okay. So I would say there's an appreciation that there are no tourists. Okay, that includes Christian tourists who are coming in large numbers, even when Jewish tourists weren't coming. There's appreciation that we need to be in touch. The interesting part of the COVID period is that, again, I've been on many Zooms like this one, where we kind of simply set up the time so that people from across different boundaries could talk together. My guess is that if it wasn't for COVID, you and I wouldn't be talking, and I wouldn't be telling the story to the people who are on this call. And I wouldn't be sharing some of these things of education that I'm trying to do. So the COVID has allowed, people say, education to be shared, legitimate feelings to be shared, concern to be worked at with one another. We'll see where that brings us. But there's a long way to go. There's a long way to go.
All right, we're almost at the end. I want to end on a couple of high notes, Rabbi. Tell us what it's like to spend Shabbat, the Sabbath, in Jerusalem. What is, every week you experience that, and I wanted your description.
Right. Look, it's one of the beauties. Even if you're not religious, everybody wishes one for Shabbat Shalom. Shabbat is the secular day too for that realm. Most things are closed. There is no transportation except in the Arab cities or in the city of Haifa for political reasons or historical reasons. Everything slows down Friday afternoon. On Friday afternoon, or Friday morning already, the supermarkets are packed. By Friday mid-morning, at least in the city of Jerusalem, and I'm sure many places throughout the country, there are flower shops set up on the side of the street so people can buy their flowers. We're on the third floor of an apartment building. We look out our window Friday night. There are a few cars, but relatively few. We're not in an ultra-Orthodox or Orthodox neighborhood. We're in a totally mixed neighborhood. Again, this is the city of Jerusalem. There are the TV and radio, while it's on, prepares you for Shabbat. There is a whole feeling of everybody preparing in this realm for this day of sanctity. Whether you celebrate it religiously, whether you go to synagogue, or whether you don't. The wish of Shabbat Shalom as they're signing off the news at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, or as the case may be. Here in Jerusalem, again, in our neighborhood, you see a lot of people walking to shul. We have many different kinds of shuls. We have 2 conservative synagogues. We have some modern Orthodox synagogues. We have a Chabad synagogue. We have a Reform synagogue not too far away. There are many up. There's an egalitarian Orthodox, what's called partnership. And people go and respect one another, at least by saying Shabbat Shalom wherever you're going to shul, that kind of thing. And it's really a feeling of the city closes down. You look out the window on Shabbat afternoon, it's very quiet. You think that everybody's taking a nap. As the afternoon goes on, it picks up again. And you can tell when Shabbat is over because the streets get very busy Saturday night. And again, I want to say this is Jerusalem, but it's not an ultra-Orthodox neighborhood. It is ultimately a mixed neighborhood of religious, secular, and everything else.
One of the things that you described in an interview I found very interesting is just the importance of a calendar, because it seems so innocuous. But the difference of having a secular calendar governing your life and the calendar, the religious calendar that governs at least part of your life in the state of Israel is a dramatic one. Am I right about that?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, Sukkot, everybody's off. Everybody's off. There are no schools. Many businesses will close down. You see Sukkot everywhere, in balconies, on streets, in major marketplaces. Again, I can't tell you what's going to happen this Sukkot with COVID, but I can tell you what happened last Sukkot. Everybody's out there the holiday. On Yom Kippur, streets are closed down. There are no cars. There are no cars. And what you have to be careful riding bicycles in the middle of the street. But you simply walk in the middle of the street. Even the secular don't drive cars in most cases on Yom Kippur. There's just a total sense that we're governed by the calendar in that realm, which makes it very special.
Right. I read yesterday in the Jerusalem Post of an incident in the Golan Heights where 4 terrorists were intercepted. They were about to undertake a major operation. It would have been horrendous if they succeeded. Unfortunately, the Israeli military intercepted them. So peace and the threat to peace is omnipresent, of course. But my last question to you is this, Rabbi, and I want you to put COVID aside for the purposes of this question. What's your view of the future of the state of Israel, in the short term? Are you optimistic? Are you concerned? How do you feel about it?
That's a short answer. Yes or no?
I gave you 5 minutes, Rabbi. I gave you 5 minutes.
Oh, okay. I thought the attorney was leading me somewhere. I had to be very careful.
No, you have 5 minutes. I'm very careful.
So, look, I would say, "Lo navi anochi v'lo ben navi," as the prophet said. I'm not a prophet or the son of a prophet. I can't prognosticate, etc. I'm in the long run very optimistic about the state of Israel. I think it's a very strong state. Militarily, it is very strong. There is a reason Hezbollah doesn't and Hamas don't want to fight right now with Israel. The bigger worry, of course, is Iran, and its encroachment through Syria and through Hezbollah close to the borders of Israel. Israel militarily is still very strong. It is still, of course, considered a startup nation. Until now, its economy has been really extremely strong. It suffered a horrible setback with great unemployment during this COVID period. It'll take a while for it to get back. I'm convinced it will get back. There are more Jewish studies here than there has ever been in any place in the entire world at any time in the entire history of the Jewish people. There are great scholars. It's culture. It's a language reborn. It's a country reborn. People still making Aliyah with all this COVID stuff. They expect more people to make Aliyah this year than last year, and more than next year to that, just by the number of people who have requested to come here for all kinds of reasons. There are a lot of problems and challenges. As I say, there is social unrest. The gaps between the haves and the have-nots are growing. The gaps between the religious and the secular is growing. The left and the right can't even talk together. This past Tisha B'Av on TV, the whole issue was sinat chinam, of idle hatred, which was supposedly the reason that the Second Temple was destroyed. And we watched a movie or documentary, if you will, of a person who tried to bring together a Haredi person and a secular person so they could have a discussion and come to some sort of agreement of certain things. They discussed, came to no agreements whatsoever. Brought an Arab Israeli and a settler together. They could talk together, no agreements whatsoever. The left and the right in politics here are on totally different wavelengths. There are many challenges here. But on the other hand, to be a Jew is to be an optimist. You have to be. There is no other way to see Jewish history. We are the ever-dying people. has been written about us by many scholars, and we're still here. We're still here. Since we've just commemorated Tisha B'Av, the great story was that Napoleon walked by a synagogue once and heard people bemoaning and crying and mourning. And he said, "What are these people crying about? What's so horrible?" "Oh, they're mourning the temple which in a city which was destroyed." "Oh, yeah, where was it? How long ago was it?" "Oh, it was 1800 years ago, the city of Jerusalem." And Napoleon, at least apocryphally, I suppose he said, if they mourn for this city now, they will eventually go back to it. We've come back. I walk the city of Jerusalem where my ancestors walked. One of the great privileges I had was to be with an Israel Bond rabbinic mission and to go into the new excavations near the city of David, and where they're now excavating the walkway that was used from the Siloam pool to the 15 steps on the southern wall that the pilgrims took. That's where my ancestors and your ancestors were and walked to the temple 2,000 years ago. And I'm here now. I saw it. And in a few years, when they eventually excavate it all, I'll be able to walk on it. We're back to stay. There are many problems. Peace is not going to happen quickly. On a political level, I don't think annexation is the way to go right now. I don't think that we're going to be close to peace for at least a generation. If my grandson is going to have his bar mitzvah, I'm unfortunately convinced that he'll be enlisting in Tzahal in the army, in the draft, and that doesn't happy in that realm either. But we're here to stay. And with the help of diaspora Jewry, those there and those coming here, with the help of those who care about the stability of the Middle East in a the only democratic state in the Middle East with all of its challenges, the only Jewish democratic state in the entire world. Steve, I'm optimistic. That's why I came. That's why we spend time. That's why people are still making Aliyah during this crazy period. Halavai will get over it. We'll go back to building the economy and building the social structure and the cultural part of it, and that those Jews in the diaspora can be out of Israel will support it, whoever the politician is, whatever the politics is, because we are ultimately one family with, as Rabbi Soloveitchik said, one fate and one destiny.
All right. Permit me, Rabbi, before I thank you, I just want to briefly preview next week's program. I'm holding up the book, Last Impressions. The author of the book, Joseph Kutrz, is our guest next week. You can get this book. It's an easy read, a nice summer read. You can get it. The link is available to the Ben McNally Bookshop through the Beth Shalom website. Joseph Kutrz is not just one of the most acclaimed authors in Canada. He's won several awards, including the Canadian Jewish Book Award. So I encourage you to get the book if you can, and certainly tune in next Tuesday. So Rabbi, it has been an honor and a great pleasure. And I wanted to thank you so much for your insightful and enlightening comments today. I want to also have a promise from you that the next time Randy and I are in Yerushalayim, we can meet you at the Orient Hotel for coffee again. And I enjoyed it.
You got a deal. I hope Bimhei Rabbi Amenu. Quickly, I hope.
Okay. Thank you much. And thank you everyone for tuning in to another session about.
Stay well and healthy. That's the main thing right now.
Well, thank you.